The history of my family was never taught to me. I climbed my family tree like Helen Keller, deaf, dumb, and blind, piecing together what it meant to be Mexican, what it meant to be American in the same place at the same time, in a broken home under joint custody in the historically and still Mexican section of Greater East Los Angeles. My father, raised by the belt buckle. My parents, who would go months without speaking, raised me under the influence of the bottle, under his raised voice, under his raised fist, and high expectations he raised a stuttering and shell-shocked child, horrified and contemptuous. My mother, raised with love, raised with encouragement, raised as a second child of the first generation born in a new country, a curious and beautiful woman raised me with a library card. Raised a boy genius who knew how to raise his hand, how to raise his voice, how to raise questions in the historically and still Mexican section of Greater East Los Angeles. I learned how to love. And I learned how to hate. In the same place, at the same time. By 5, I could play chess, roll the punches, quote Shakespeare, identify the instruments of an orchestra, and fall asleep to the sounds of gunshots. Pretended they were fireworks. To the sounds of my father screaming, pretended it was the television under the cover of blankets in the deepest, loneliest stretches of the night by flashlight. I learned how to read or pretend to be asleep to avoid life. By 5, I memorized the names and terms of all the presidents. It became something of an obsession, wanting to prove something to someone, just not sure who. By 8, I told my father, thinking he'd be proud of me, that I could see myself in that Oval Office before he sat me down and said, "Son, we are Mexican, and this is America. That's never going to happen." The history of my family was never taught to me. I climbed my family tree, bitter and thorny, heard stories how my great-grandfather died sick off that Colorado black when he got slaving away in the coal mines of America, yet somehow died back in Mexico, read a book about something called the Mexican Repatriation Act, and began to piece together what brought him here, and then what sent him back, while the story of how my grandfather met my grandmother was made that much clearer, and I began to understand that our whole family had been deported from this country in the 1930s for no reason other than their last name and the color of their skin, and I spent the rest of my adolescence trying to piece together how I may never have been born. Had that never happened, is I spent the better part of my life understanding that oppression runs through my veins, and that is not a history that goes down easy. So the boy genius who would be president now began to hate this country and all that it stood for and all that it trampled over. The racism that routed my mother's father and drove him from its borders. The poverty and the misery that drove my father's father to become an alcoholic. That bitter legacy that never goes down easy that drove my father and I to become alcoholics. Yes, I hated all of it. It's mindless consumption. It's mindless labor. The pointlessness of moving a box from one corner of the room to another. The misery of living paycheck to paycheck. A mindless slave to next month's rent in a heartless economy that drove me towards homelessness as I slept in my car under the stars, under a flag, under an Old Glory flag so arrogantly over me. I hated the stares of co-workers who knew I had not seen a bed in weeks. Their whispers that you could hear had never known what it was to shower in a gas station sink. I hated the hatred that tore me from my father, the pride that kept me from my mother, and when I lost that job, I shot through my days aimlessly, beaten down by the summer heat like a stray dog, wandering the summer streets, and I remembered my mother reading me Shakespeare, and I remembered all that I was supposed to be. Some kind of prodigy, some kind of boy genius, so much potential, but now homeless, and I hated this country and all that it stood for, a government supposedly for and by the people that had never had anything to offer me but debts, with jobs that robbed my time and energy of all meaning and value, and took and took and took until there was nothing left in this cruel joke of a meritocracy which now seemed poised, guiltless and indifferent to lead me to my death. Yes, I hated all of it, but not so much nearly as I hated myself. And I found myself, and of all places, drunk and debased, barely able to stand, barely still a man, out of my mind, in a walking, talking, drunken coma, sleepwalking through a childhood sanctuary. I found myself at the library applying for a card. But I came back the next day, and the next, and the next, and the next, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I began to see that the true history of this country, The real nature of this economy was something that was never taught to me, and had never been a question of peoples or borders or a new world order. And it wasn't the white man, it wasn't my dad, it wasn't any personal failure, and there was no global conspiracy, no Illuminati. It was the very nature of the global economy, the very nature of private property. And I read, and I read, and I read. I read Marx, I read Engels, I read Lenin, and I began to agree with them. I saw for the first time that I belonged, that I wasn't alone, that it wasn't my fault, that I was a worker, that I was working class, that I was proletarian. So very proud of it. A boy genius who dreamed of becoming president, who grew into a man much more likely to rise as local congressman, demand his resignation unless he could provide a country worth living in, one free of racism, free of prisons, free of the oppression and exploitation of women, free from the social Darwinism that makes beasts of us all, free, 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 thank God Almighty, free from capitalism. It's the dustbin of history, the history of my family, the meaning of my life, the truth about the world, and my place within it was never taught to me. Because there are some things you have to learn for yourself. Thank you guys.